Hi, everybody. Welcome to the weekly marine science seminar series brought to you by Shoals Marine Lab on this stormy Tuesday night for most of us. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Shoals Marine Lab is the largest and the oldest undergraduate focused marine lab in the country. We are operated by Cornell and the University of New Hampshire, and we are located in the Isles of Shoals, about 10 miles offshore of Portsmouth, New Hampshire on Appledore Island. So every summer we host these science talks every week on the island. We call them Rock Talks in honor of our rocky campus, rocky shoreline. And this year we are bringing them to you online, and we're really excited about that and really excited particularly about our speaker tonight. Our format for this evening is 45 minutes of speaking and then 15 minutes of Q&A. So if you have a question at any point, you can put it in the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom of the screen here. Click on that, type in your question, and at the very end of Michelle's talk, we'll get to them. I'll read the questions out loud and she'll answer them. And she has graciously said that she will answer any of them that we don't get to via email. So don't stress out if we don't get to your question. So that's really generous. Thank you, Michelle, for that. So tonight is Michelle Staudinger. She is a science coordinator at the Department of the Interior Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. She's also adjunct faculty at UMass Amherst. She's a broadly trained marine scientist, and the focus of her work, much of it, is on how climate change influences the timing of recurring life events, phenology, and interactions among species, and the ecology and management implications of those impacts. Michelle contributed to the 2013 and 18 National Climate Assessment as part of the Biodiversity, Ecosystem, and Ecosystem Services chapters. Something I really admire about Michelle's work is how she moves across species taxa with ease. You're going to see that tonight, and how collaborative she is. As a result of these two skills, she really pulls together big, innovative research, and I think you'll get a taste of that. She got her undergraduate degree in marine biology and environmental science from Boston University. She got her master's degree from Stony Brook and her PhD from UMass Amherst. Tonight, she is talking to us about the impacts of warming due to climate change in the Gulf of Maine ecosystems. Michelle, thank you so much. I'm going to hand the floor to you now.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. Sure. Okay, so can you see my screen all right?
Yes.
Looks great, thanks.
Terrific, okay. All right, well, good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to present to you, even though I can't see you all in person. And I think this is the third year in a row I've been invited to come out to Shoals, and for one reason or another, it hasn't worked out. So one day I will make it to the Rock and maybe give another one of these. So let's just jump right in. I'm just going to start with a quick roadmap of what I'm going to go over tonight. I'm going to start out by going over the observed impacts of climate change in the Northeast and the Gulf of Maine. And then we'll talk about what we're expecting in the future in terms of projected impacts of climate change. And then I'm going to talk a bit about species responses to those impacts, and we're going to do a deeper dive on my favorite subject, shifts in phenology, and sort of interwoven in the phenology discussion, and towards the end, I'll cover some implications of climate impacts and species responses, as well as some solutions. So let's start off talking about what we've observed in terms of climate impacts in our region. Well, the Gulf of Maine and the Northeast are some of the fastest warming places on Earth. The Gulf of Maine is considered a hotspot of warming, with rates of sea surface temperature increasing at a rate that's 3 times faster than the global average, as you can see in this, this graph here, and the spatial plot on the right-hand side. And the rates of warming have both an interannual cycle as well as a seasonal cycle, and some of the strongest rates of warming that we've seen in the Gulf of Maine are occurring during the summer in comparison to winter. And so interannual changes and decadal changes in temperature and seasonal changes in temperature mean that the seasons are changing, but not like they have historically. So in this plot here, you can see what we call spring onset, which is the timing of when spring occurs, when we go from the winter season to the spring season. And as you can see, from about the early 1980s to the early 2000s, there was some variation across the subregions within the Gulf of Maine and greater Northwest Atlantic. But it was pretty constant for the most part until the early 2000s, where we started to see a rapid advancement of spring onset. And now over the last 2 decades, we've seen spring occur about 2 weeks earlier. We've also seen an earlier transition from spring to summer, and a later transition to fall. And so all of this has resulted in an increase in the overall duration of summer and a decrease in the duration of winter. We've also seen an increase in extreme warming years, which we can call in the marine environment, marine heat waves. And in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen 3 annual events in 2012, 2016, and 2018, which were some of the warmest years on record. And this has had significant impacts on the fish and wildlife in our region, as well as many of the human activities that surround the ocean. And I thought it might interest some of you to know that in the Pacific, we call these marine heat waves blobs. And I think that if you look at these images here, and you look at this old movie flyer, you can sort of see that the images for the heat wave blobs in the 2 panels on the right look very much like this horror movie blob. And they really are, they really do look quite similar. I don't know who actually came up with this term, but they were pretty dead on. And they really are killer blobs. These marine heat waves and heat blobs really do disrupt ecosystems, and especially in the Pacific, have been responsible for killing millions of seabirds and other fish and wildlife in our region. So they're quite serious, all joking aside. So in our region, the primary reason that we are seeing such anomalous warming has to do with the interaction of regional circulation and currents. So there's 2 primary currents that affect our the conditions off of our coast. The Gulf Stream current, which delivers warm, salty slope water from the south, and the Labrador current, which delivers cold, fresh shelf water from the north. And these 2 currents interact in the Grand Banks region. And as many of you may know, the Gulf Stream current meanders quite a bit. And when it's in a more northerly position, it actually cuts off, sort of pinches off the Labrador current, which prevents that colder water from mixing into the water that's delivered into the Gulf of Maine region. And so that is the primary reason why we're seeing the anomalous warming in the Gulf of Maine. In addition, the Northeast is seeing more precipitation, and this is affecting our hydrological cycles. With the increase in temperature, particularly during the winter and early spring, this is causing more precipitation to fall as rain and less as snow, and we're having more rain on snow events. And so this has led to an increase in the total amount of water that is being delivered to our coasts, and it's also shifted the timing of that delivery earlier within that winter-spring transition time period. And this has pretty significant impacts on the downstream systems along our coast. With more water and the earlier timing of that water and more heavy precipitation events, this is moving more nutrients and sediment and pollution and pollutants to downstream systems, which is causing a variety of problems. It can increase, or I'm sorry, it can change the salinity regimes, change primary productivity regimes, alter community composition, and also affect coastal acidification, which I'm not going to go into because that's a whole talk in itself. So those are some of the those are some of the observed impacts that we've seen in the region to date. And so now I'm going to focus on some projected impacts, and several of the results that I'm going to show you in the coming slides come from a working group that I participated in last year, which was part of the Gulf of Maine 2050 conference, which happened in November, where we tried to envision what the Gulf of Maine would look like in 30 years. And so this first set of results basically shows the same trend on the left in terms of the observed record. That's the 30-year average in the black line. And I've shown this trend in a couple of slides, they've just been different iterations of the same presentation. But what's different about this slide is now we see the projections resulting from 4 different downscaled model simulations. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of those climate models, but the main takeaway that I want you to get from this is that all of the projections of the 4 different models show that in 2050, we're expecting significantly warmer conditions than we've seen historically. And if you remember the slide that I showed of those anomalous warm years in 2012, 2016, and 2018, we can sort of relate the conditions in these different model projections of 2050 to those anomalous years and make comparisons and think about what the future might look like if any of these models were to become realized. And I also wanted to mention that we can't actually predict the future. We don't know which model is right. And a lot of what happens in the future really depends on what actions we take to curb emissions now. And that will in part determine what the future holds for us. So the most optimistic model is the one that's sort of in the bluer tones, and those would relate to the conditions that we saw in the 2016 and 2018 anomalous warming years. And then the warmer yellowish colors are the more pessimistic models that basically show that if we continue sort of as the business as usual scenario and we don't change our emissions behavior, that sort of the worst case scenario is we'll have the future in 2050 will feel very much like the 2012 anomalous warming year. And in the most pessimistic scenario, 2012 would be would feel like a cool year. So we also wanted to explore these projections spatially. So these plots show the sea surface conditions and bottom conditions using those same model projections that I just showed you. And they're ordered from the sort of most optimistic model on the left to the most pessimistic model on the right. And the main point here is that all of the models project increases in sea surface and bottom temperatures everywhere within the Gulf of Maine. And they basically just vary by the overall magnitude that we'll experience. So in terms of projected precipitation, there's a bit more uncertainty in the projections of precipitation in comparison to temperature. But we do expect to see similar conditions to that which we have already experienced, with the region becoming wetter in the future with more extreme precipitation events and more precipitation in winter and spring. And so this also ties in with the projections in temperature to create our understanding of what the projections of salinity will look like in the Gulf of Maine for 2050. So similar to precipitation, we expect salinity predictions to be more variable. They have a bit more uncertainty, and they're generally inversely related to warming in terms of the simulations that I showed you in 2 slides ago. So you can see from the surface conditions, which are shown in the panels on the top of the screen, and the bottom conditions, that we see a little bit, as I said, we see a little bit more variation in what the models are projecting. And again, we don't know which projection is the correct one, but what these model projections together tell us is that we expect to see a warmer, fresher, and more stratified Gulf of Maine in the future, and this is expected to further alter the circulation in the region. So how are species responding to these impacts? Well, one of the most common responses to climate change is shifts in species range and distribution. And in general, over the last several decades, regional warming has caused many species to shift their range and distribution north towards the poles, as well as to depth as they have sought out thermal optima. And we've seen more historically familiar cold water species associated with the Gulf of Maine start shifting out. So species like cod, which are at the southern edge of their range, and to deeper depths. And we've seen more an influx of species that are more typical of the mid-Atlantic bike, like those shown here, which are black sea bass, summer flounder, and longfin inshore squid moving into the Gulf of Maine. Species like the North Atlantic right whale are spending less time in the Gulf of Maine and using other habitats further north. And for less mobile species, we're seeing shifts primarily in their productivity in the region. And so this is true of phytoplankton and zooplankton, including Calanus finmarchus, which is shown on the bottom right here. This is a very important prey species at the bottom of the food chain in the Gulf of Maine that supports pretty much the rest of the food chain, including those the larval phases of some of the fish species that I'm showing here, and North Atlantic right whales. So to give you sort of another view of what a shift in range looks like, this video shows how the center of biomass of red hake has shifted over time in the region as they've followed their thermal optima. And you can see that those warmer colors show an increase in biomass, and you can see that that those warmer colors are increasingly more prevalent towards the north end of the range. Another response to warming is an increase in invasions and disease. So non-native invasive species like these sea squirts, which are shown on the left, are infiltrating our region and can cause problems for fishermen in terms of fouling their gear, as is shown here. And species like green crabs, which are invasive but have been in the Gulf of Maine for over 100 years, are increasing their abundance pretty dramatically due to their generalist behavior and ability to take advantage of these warmer conditions. These green crabs can be pretty damaging to important habitats like eelgrass beds and populations of softshell crabs. And we're also seeing an increase in diseases such as harmful algal blooms and diseases that are associated with shellfish such as MSX. So with all of these species shifting around, we've got native shifters shifting in and out, and non-native invasive species increasing in abundance across our region. This is all leading to novel combinations of species and novel communities that we've never seen before. And so this is sort of very interesting to watch as a scientist and try to understand how all of these different species are going to live together and how they're going to affect the natural resources that we rely on in the region. Some of these invasions and recombinations and new communities may provide opportunities for some industries, and they may lead to a lot of challenges in other situations. And they may also change certain cultural practices that we've come to be used to in the region. And so that's some of the things that folks are trying to understand right now, is how this will all manifest. And ultimately, all these new combinations of species may make the Gulf of Maine look like a very different place than it did 20 or 30 years ago, 20 or 30 years into the future. And so as part of that Gulf of Maine 2050 working group that I mentioned, that some of these results came from, we tried, as I mentioned, we tried to envision what the world would look like in the Gulf of Maine in 2050 or so. And this figure basically shows that we believe that the seabirds and the right whales are largely going to be shifting out of the region or declining, and we'll see different combinations of fish species with less cod and things like more black sea bass in the region, also more squid in the region, and probably fewer lobsters in the region. All right, so now we're going to go on and do a deeper dive on a particular response to climate change, which is near and dear to my heart, which is the study of phenology, or the timing of critical reoccurring life events. This is really just a fancy climate word for seasonality. And so these life history events are species specific, and they occur at a particular time of year and at a specific location. And this can manifest as shifts in migration, in the timing of breeding and reproduction, early life history and development schedules, as well as predator-prey relationships. So why is the Gulf of Maine a really good place to study shifts in phenology? Well, as we've already discussed, it's a hotspot of warming, and it's a highly seasonal system. And it's also a seasonal destination for many fish and wildlife species. Many highly migratory seabirds, marine mammals, and fishes migrate into the region, particularly during the warmer months, to take advantage of the high productivity of our region, where they raise their young and fatten up before they move on to their next phase of life. And it's also a seasonal destination for humans, as Maine's sort of call is that it's the vacation land state, although not this year. No one's allowed to come this year, sorry. So over the last few years, I led a working group which was trying to understand how phenology was changing in the Gulf of Maine. And we came up with this, one of the first things that we did as part of that working group was to come up with a conceptual model of all of the major phenological events and linkages in the Gulf of Maine. And so we tried to break it down by major taxonomic groups and seasonal strategies and by season. And that's what this figure is trying to depict here. So we have the 4 seasons represented, moving left to right: winter, spring, summer, fall. And then we have the different environmental seasonal drivers that are then linked to some of the more important life history events of different taxonomic groups, including forage fish, or I'm sorry, phytoplankton, zooplankton, forage fish, this is moving top to bottom. more commercially important upper trophic level fishes, seabirds, marine mammals, and then on the very bottom, we are depicting anadromous fishes. And the yellow and gray colored bars indicate the duration of different phenological events, and then you can see the arrows connect those different environmental drivers to those phenological events. So if you kind of move from, for example, increasing sea surface temperature in the spring, we see that the waters stratify, and that's linked to an increase in mixing and which causes phytoplankton blooms, which then leads to more secondary production in terms of the zooplankton, which then provides food for our larval fishes and forage fishes in the region, which then support those higher trophic levels. Another major activity that we conducted as part of this working group was to synthesize all of the current evidence for shifts in phenology in the Gulf of Maine. We did this through a review of the literature and through expert opinion, and this figure summarizes those results. And so surprisingly, we only found about 20 studies that have shown definitive evidence for shifts in phenology in the region. And the other surprising result of this activity was, if you look across the different groups that are represented in this figure, you can see that the directionality and the duration of the shifts, which are represented by the blue and green arrows, they really vary quite a bit. So we've got some things shifting earlier, some things shifting later, some groups shifting in both directions, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And then we certainly found some cases of no evidence for shifts at all. So this is really quite a departure from how we think about shifting phenology in terrestrial systems, where the rule of thumb is that everything is shifting earlier. So all of this variability across the ecosystem, which we've depicted moving bottom to top from the base of the food chain through different taxonomic groups all the way up to human activities, all of this variability across the ecosystem suggests a high potential for mismatches. So what do I mean when I talk about mismatches? Well, this is an ecological implication of shifts in phenology, as well as other shifts in species responses to climate change. And the reason why I'm showing this picture of a white rabbit in the middle of a marine science talk is that this is probably the best depiction of an ecological mismatch that I can think of. So this snowshoe hare typically matches its coat color to the snow so that it can hide from predators. But you can clearly see that this rabbit is mismatched with its environment right now, and so it's going to be very vulnerable to predators. But an ecological mismatch is not always that obvious. The other ecological implications of a mismatch include changes in fitness, productivity, perhaps longer developmental periods, mortality, of course, which all scales up to changes in population dynamics and ecosystem functions. And so one potential mismatch that I've been investigating along with a variety of other folks is the potential mismatch of forage fish to colonial nesting seabirds in the region. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. So just to quickly go into a little bit more detail on the larval fish and the forage fish, we can see in this plot on the left hand, you can see mean larval abundance and how it varies by season, which is depicted in the different colors. And then you can see, so this was a long-term study conducted originally by Harvey Walsh, et al. Using a long-term data set from the National Marine Fisheries Service EcoMon survey. And they looked for shifts in larval fish phenology across 19 different species. And what you can see on the right-hand plot here is the different responses across this suite, across this taxonomic group. So we saw a variety of species that showed no change between the late 1970s, 1980s, and the later period, which was the early 2000s. Then you see some species shifting earlier and some species shifting later. And as you can see from the different colors of the names of those different species, you see those shifts or non-shifts happening across seasons. So just a lot of variation in when larval fish are occurring in the environment. And so going back to our to why this is important to the seabirds in terms of mismatches. A variety of seabirds, terns and alcids and other species migrate to the Gulf of Maine during the summer to raise their chicks on many of our coastal islands. And even though seabirds are very mobile, during the nesting season, they're very place-based and they're very dependent on the local abundance of the fishes near these islands where they're raising their young. And these seabirds are highly specialized and rely on 3 or 4 different groups of prey fish to support their young during this time period. And here you can see this, this parent delivering a larval sand lance to one of its chicks. So this sand lance is considered a very highly nutritious forage fish. It's very lipid rich, and as you can see, it's very easy for the chicks to swallow. So what folks are really worried about is that sand lance and a couple of the other primary forage fish are becoming mismatched during this time period. And if you remember in that photo, the chick was eating a much larger fish, which is called a butterfish. That fish is much more difficult to swallow and less nutritious than sand lance and some of these other forage fish, which I'm going to show you a little bit more in a moment. And so the consequence is that their chicks may not get enough nutrition and either take longer to fledge or may have increased mortality rates. So what I'm showing here is some work from my graduate student, Keenan Ukola, who has been studying these birds for many years now. He works with Project Puffin. He just finished his master's last year. And so he investigated the seasonal dietary phenology of terns on a variety of the Maine coastal islands. And what we found was that there's a definitive seasonality to the importance of the major prey fish to the terns. And so what I've done here is on the x-axis, we've got year day. And so day 170 lines up to around June 15th when eggs are laid. July 10th aligns with about day 190 or so when chicks hatch. And in early August around day 215, that's when chicks are fledging. So you can see that earlier in the season, hake are more important, so that when these chicks are just hatching, hake is, the timing of hake being delivered to them is most important, whereas herring becomes more important later in the season. Sand lance is important sort of consistently throughout the season. And we start to, and so those are the primary prey that we're concerned about. And then you can sort of see that towards the end of the season, butterfish and other fish increase in the tern diets, and those are considered less quality prey. And so again, the concern here is that if certain species shift earlier or later, they're going to miss this pretty narrow window when the terns rely on these highly nutritious fish species for growth and development. So another example that I wanted to share with you is concerning the Alewife spring spawning migration. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Alewife, they're one of 2 species that make up river herring. This is a group of anadromous fish that migrate between the ocean up through our estuaries and coastal streams into freshwater ponds to spawn. The juveniles grow up in the freshwater before they emigrate back out to the ocean in the late summer and fall to grow up as adults, and then they repeat this cycle every year. So there's similar life history to salmon, except alewife don't die after they spawn. They come back year after year. So another student of mine has been working on looking at 12 different river systems across the state of Massachusetts to see how the timing of the spring spawning migration changed over the last 20 years or so. And again, we see a lot of variation. So this plot shows the 12 different sites ordered on the y-axis, ordered north to south. And what we're showing with these bar and whisker plots is whether there's been a shift in when these fish have arrived at these different sites in the spring. And so further departures from that dotted line mean there's been more of a shift. If it's an earlier shift, the dot will be to the left of that line, and if it's a later shift, it'll be to the right. And those with stars are significant shifts. And so again, we found that there's just a lot of variation among sites within the species. So even within sort of a narrow regional area, we see a lot of variation just within this one species. And the other takeaway here is that we actually didn't see statistical shifts in most of these systems, although if you can see the site that's labeled ACU, that's the Acushnet, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. There's clearly a shift that has occurred there, and so we think that perhaps there's just not enough years of data to detect a statistical significance, but we believe that this is an ecologically significant shift. And so in this case study with Alewife, we've also modeled the underlying environmental drivers that are affecting the timing of arrival in these coastal rivers and ponds, which is actually something that isn't done very often. And the main point that I want to make here is that when we looked at a variety of different environmental drivers, which included things like sea surface temperature, the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is this broader atmospheric decadal cycling, and we looked across different seasonal temperature drivers. What we found was that it was a combination of drivers in the winter as well as early spring that influenced run timing. And the combination of those environmental drivers we are considering to be winter severity. So it was a combination of winter minimum temperatures, the duration of winter, as well as the conditions brought about by the North Atlantic Oscillation, which includes, when it's in the positive phase, warmer ocean conditions and higher precipitation. So what this tells us is that you can't just look at the season in which you're interested in a phenological event occurring. You have to sort of look backwards in time as well. And this is going to be really true, especially for highly migratory species like seabirds that may be migrating as far as Antarctica, large whales, which I'll talk about in a moment, and these alewife, which are migrating from offshore environments into inshore environments, that the place that they're coming from and the season prior to when they're arriving in the place that you're interested in them may be more important than the conditions at that location. So I hope that made sense. All right, so the last case study that I wanted to mention is the North Atlantic right whale populations and the timing of their use of Cape Cod Bay. So there's been some indications that these whales have changed the patterns of habitat use in the area. And with some colleagues at the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life at the New England Aquarium, we really wanted to look at these trends and figure this out. And so what we found using a series of occupancy models is that these highly endangered whales have shifted the timing of their spring, in the spring foraging ground to stay in Cape Cod Bay almost 3 weeks later in the year than they have historically. And so this has some pretty serious implications for interactions with the lobster fishery, which I'll talk about in a moment. But again, this is really quite far in the opposite direction of what was expected. Most of the phenological research that's in the literature suggests that organisms are shifting earlier, not later, especially during the spring season. So this was quite a surprise. So to start wrapping things up, I wanted to discuss further some of the ecological and management implications of shifts in phenology, and really drive home the point that where, when, and how much a species is shifting can really influence interactions with human activities and the efficacy of our management tools. Many of our management tools are fixed in time and space and do not well account for shifting species. This includes things like time of year restrictions in terms of water withdrawals in coastal waterways, our fishery seasons and closed areas, as well as construction and operation windows for things like dredging and wind energy operations. So how can we better account for shifts in phenology and other shifts that are species responding to climate change in terms of conservation and management decisions? Well, a lot of the tools in our conservation toolbox that we already know how to do well can help species adapt to climate change. So if we think back to that Alewife example that I talked about earlier, the study systems where we saw some of the most dramatic responses in phenology were sites where there had been major restoration. And in the case of the Acushnet, they had removed some barriers to passage, and this led almost immediately to an increase in the number of fish that were able to pass through that site and be counted passing into their spawning ponds. So restoration works. By restoring connectivity, we were able to see a major effect not only on the population size, but on the phenology. And so what we think is happening here is that the overall demography of this population was able to expand. We know that older, larger fish typically move into systems earlier. And so that may have affected the earlier phenology. And what this really translates to is that when you have a bigger, more robust population, that population just has more options and more flexibility to utilize a longer period of time. And when you push species into a much narrower window, that can make them much more vulnerable to extreme events. So this plot on the right shows the amount of habitat that was lost between 1600 and 1900 due to things like damming rivers and putting in culverts and such. And so if we were able to restore that that habitat to alewife and other diadromous fishes, we could really sort of do them a big favor in terms of having more adaptive capacity to climate change and a range of other stressors that they face. Another management tool is to think more holistically about systems and think about how harvesting forage fish affects other species that we may want to harvest and care about. So if a cod likes to eat a herring and we fish too much herring out of the ocean and there's not enough left for a cod or a seabird, then we're sort of we're not doing ourselves or them any favors. So thinking about precautionary and ecosystem-based approaches that consider predator-prey relationships and the ecosystem services that those forage fish provide is really important. In our seabird work, we know that recruitment of Atlantic herring is directly related to the frequency of occurrence in their diets. So more herring, more better for the birds. And we've taken some pretty good steps in recent years to protect forage fish with some recent control rules, which are basically doing just this, thinking more in a more precautionary mindset and more holistically. And so hopefully we'll keep moving in that direction. And then finally, back to the right whales. Using different monitoring tools is going to be really important. So as I showed earlier, we know that right whales have shifted almost 3 weeks later in terms of the time when they're sort of most abundant in Cape Cod Bay. But as you can see from this figure, there's a lot of variation around that trend line. And so using the long-term data to understand the overall trends in the region, but then also using real-time monitoring to keep track of that interannual variation will really, I think, help reduce wildlife human interactions and be a win-win situation for everyone. So just this year, I pulled a headline from the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries website. You can see that on April 27th, they extended the closure of Cape Cod Bay due to fixed gear because there were whales still in the system. And then just a couple of days later, they rescinded it because the whales had left the area. So using a combination of these monitoring tools is really going to help us be successful in avoiding negative interactions with right whales and other species that are of high conservation concern. So just some final thoughts to conclude with. Hopefully I've shown you that shifts in phenology are important, but they also vary widely across seasons, across species, within species, and across locations. And so that scales up to just a lot of uncertainty and increased potential for risk. And so we do need to think very carefully about how species are responding, not in just their timing, but in some of those other ways that I talked about earlier to the different drivers, and understanding how those drivers are affecting those responses so that we can predict out into the future better. And this is also an area that's just wide open for research and new inquiries. We only found 20 studies in a comprehensive synthesis exercise, and we really think that there's a lot more opportunities to learn more about shifts in phenology in the region. It just requires dusting off some old long-term monitoring data sets and looking across different scales. And so if you're involved in any sort of long-term data set collection, just know that they're really critical to understanding trends and how species are responding to climate change and how communities are responding to climate change, and they're just really important for our overall understanding of the system. And then finally, understanding where, when, and how much species are responding are really key to adapting to these future impacts. So yeah, that's it. I wanted to just acknowledge all of the wonderful people that I work with that make all of this possible. I just get the pleasure to work with so many terrific people, really smart people who also share interests in this. And if you want to learn more about any of this research, you can check out the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center's website and look under projects to learn more. And I guess with that, I'll take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. I definitely heard that Shoals Marine Lab has a lot of long-term monitoring studies, and I heard my takeaway from your talk is do more phenology investigations of those data sets. We actually have a fellowship every summer for postdocs. So if anyone in this crowd comes across a postdoc interested in looking at these long-term data sets, looking at these things, Michelle, that'd be amazing. We have some questions for you.
Great.
Okay, first up, Donna's asking, how much does fishing and overfishing of specific species play in the changes of diversity of fish and other organisms in the Gulf of Maine?
Well, it certainly plays a big role. I mean, we are probably the biggest engineers and ecosystem engineers out there, right? We do a really good job of catching fish. And we don't, I mean, it depends on the fisheries, but there's some gear types and fisheries that target single species, and then there's certainly gear and fisheries that target multiple species simultaneously. So yeah, every time we remove biomass from the ocean, we affect the community dynamics. And that plays into all of this. So when I was talking about holistic approaches, really trying to think of the right balance of how much to take out and how much to leave in to maintain healthy ecosystems is a goal for sustainability.
Sort of on that same note, there's another question about teasing apart the contributions of current changes in rising temperature, falling salinity, increasing nutrients to these observed shifts in phenology in the Gulf of Maine.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tease those things apart?
It's really tough. I forgot to mention how much we banged our heads against the wall and scratched our heads when we were trying to figure out which were the most important drivers, for example, in understanding the timing of the Alewife spawning migrations, but we've also done this with trying to understand the frequency of occurrence of the different fishes in the seabird diets, as well as the occupancy of Cape Cod Bay with right whales. So we're trying to do all of this. And the way that we do that is we build some pretty complicated general linear models, and we basically throw a bunch of environmental variables at the response variable to see which one comes out as significant. And there's multiple iterations of and combinations of these environmental variables. That's what I was trying to get at when I was talking about the alewife, is that you have to look beyond the season of interest often to figure out what's really causing the whatever species you're interested in to move at the time that they're moving. Hope that helped.
Jim Coyer's asking, is the warming surface temperature of the Gulf of Maine driving the thermocline deeper? And if so, how will this affect upwelling on offshore banks?
That's a tough one, because even though I play a oceanographer on TV, I actually don't know that much. It's tricky. I don't have that that information at my fingertips. I'm going to pass on that one. If you want to email me that one, I can look it up and get back to you. I work with some really great climate modelers who would be able to answer that in a second. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Don't forget, folks who are raising your hand, I'm looking at Mike Ziegler, put your question in the Q&A. Ingrid's asking, how does the timing of the alewife spawning upstream overlap with major agricultural runoff and pollution? Is there impact? That's an interesting.
That is an interesting one. So there are time of year restrictions in place in many of these streams that are meant to protect the anadromous fish during their migrations. So you're not allowed to do any major water withdrawals during those windows that would affect passage for the fish. We are currently working on modeling whether flow or temperature is more important in determining when the fish move within the coastal streams. And so far, temperature has shown to be more important than flow. That being said, if you know, I would defer to some of my colleagues who probably monitor these systems more on a daily level. But I think what I've generally heard is that if there's like a lot of water moving through the system, if there's a really big storm, the fish aren't going to move on those days. They're going to look for more of like probably the average moderate conditions. They're not going to move during really low flows, and they're not going to move during really high flows. So if you had a storm that was pushing all those nutrients and sediments and pollutants down, you know, the fish are probably going to experience them at some point. Like if they're in the estuaries and there's like a dump going on, you know, into that habitat, they might be exposed to that. But that's probably the best answer I could give you, is that, you know, they're probably not migrating during an event that would be moving that kind of stuff downstream. But if they were downstream already, they'd probably be experiencing it. I hope that answered your question.
Well, Ingrid, if she didn't, put your question back in there. Oh goodness, lots are coming in the next 5 minutes.
No.
About 15 minutes into your lecture, you showed a chart of, quote, high surface temperature anomalies.
Mm-hmm.
In that chart, it seemed that the surface temperatures in the 50s were almost as high as today. Do you have an explanation about that?
Yeah, so certainly there's some natural variation due to oceanographic and atmospheric processes like the NAO, and just natural cycles of highs and lows. And so we go through periods where the temperatures are higher or lower, and there's there's interannual variability in that as well. But we are trending towards warmer. Certainly in the last 20 years, more so than over the last 50 years. And we keep seeing these anomalously warm years that are bringing that trend further up and up. So I'd have to pull that back up again, but to see specifically what you might have been talking about. But yeah, there's, you know, we've had warm years in the past, but the point is we're having more and more and more warm years in the present. And that we're expecting more in the future.
Mike Ziegler has a really interesting question here. He's a West Coast scientist, okay, so just prepping you for that. He says, strengthening stratification during marine heat waves has led to seabird die-offs due to reduced access to prey. This is happening in MERS in the Gulf of Alaska. Mm-hmm. With increased stratification anticipated in the Gulf of Maine, do you expect a similar effect on diving seabirds? Question.
Yeah, it'll depend on this. It'll depend on the seabirds. The different seabirds are going to be able to dive to different depths, and it will also affect which species are in surface waters in terms of like the larval fish and the forage fish. So the one thing about the stratification that those models were projecting in towards 2050 was. Yeah, I mean, it's going to change the salinity in the surface water, which could change what species are able to tolerate those conditions. And we're also expecting the circulation strength in the Gulf of Maine to change as a result of that stratification. And so that could affect how long species are available as they sort of are circulated through the Gulf of Maine. So if circulation speeds up, the window of time when they occur in a certain place as they're sort of moving with the currents could be shortened. And so like one consequence of that is if you are a seabird on nesting on an island and things are moving past you faster, you know, that's going to potentially affect your ability to forage effectively in the future. So that's sort of one consequence of all that. But you know, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. But that's sort of what we discussed and anticipated might happen.
Donna says, last summer, Jim Coyer, who's a former Shoals faculty, gave a good lecture with the message, quote, move, adapt, or die. That sounds like a gym talk. We even put this on our Shoals t-shirts. They obviously loved it. Are there any species that are closer to dying out rather than moving? Are there species that will be better able to move or adapt in the Gulf of Maine? What do you think?
Yeah, I've certainly heard the move, adapt, or die before. So, you know, anything that's less mobile, that doesn't have a life phase that has a high dispersal rate is going to be more susceptible to impacts. Trying to think of, so oysters would be one example of a species that those that are already forming a reef, you know, that reef can't move. So those individuals are going to be more at risk, but they do spawn and use currents, so they might be able to disperse into new areas. Yeah, and the other sort of characteristic that makes species more vulnerable is how specialized they are in a particular resource, whether it's food or habitat. And so the sensitivity of those dependent interactions and how they're disrupted are things to watch for sure. The biggest problem that we think about is the pace at which climate is changing right now. It is changing so rapidly that species don't have that. They just can't adapt fast enough. I think most species could adapt if we could slow down the rate of warming to some capacity. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly lots of concern that we're not going to be able to save every species, especially if we don't slow things down.
Well, on that kind of grim note, thank you, Michelle. That was great. It's 8:32, so I'm gonna stop with the questions now. Thank you so much for answering them all. You answered them all.
Oh, great.
That was great.
Can somebody ask me like a positive question? There we go. I hate ending on a bad note.
The amount of amazing
solutions.
research that you have like pointed to that can be done in the Gulf of Maine, I think is exciting. And I think there's a lot of students in this audience and that they should be excited about where they can go next. You just kind of laid out the groundwork for them. That part's good.
If he wants to ask me any other questions or wants any feedback on an idea, I'd be happy to answer emails.
Great, thank you. So everyone should know, in fact, there was one comment from someone who teaches a lot saying this is such a great like classic talk on climate change and then drilling down to the Gulf of Maine, and they really appreciated it. And I pointed out to her that we are recording all of our rock talks, all of our seminar talks, and they are on our website, shoalsmarinelaboratory.org. So please, you can see this again. You can watch it later and share it with whoever you want. So that information is there. And our next speaker is next Tuesday, Jonathan Grabowski from Northeastern University, Michelle knows, and a former Shoals faculty member and mentor. He is speaking 7:30 again next on July 7th. And his work looks at issues in ecology, fisheries, conservation biology, and economics. So he's another really broad-based ecologist. So looking forward to that talk. You can find information about signing up for that and all the other events we're doing this summer online at shoalsmarinelaboratory.org. And if you want, there's also a donation button there if you want to support this work. In general, thank you so much for joining us. And Michelle, thank you again for that great talk. Everyone have a great evening. Take care, and we'll see you again here soon. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.